Hey, let me help you to get acquainted to the book of Jonah just a little bit. Maybe you're not all that familiar with him. So when we consider the Old Testament is God taking a group of people and making them into be his people. He sends them into the land that he gives them. And when they get into the land, they cry out for a king. When they get a king, ultimately, their king's hearts lead them away from God. The kingdom of Israel splits, and on one end of the spectrum, we have Judah, and on the other end of the spectrum, we have Israel. And these nation king states largely remain separate until they go into exile. Now, the prophet Jonah is a prophet of God sent to the kingdom of Israel. Now, when we are reading through the historical books of the Old Testament, so 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, these books will describe the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. And so the kingdom of Israel doesn't really have kings that are good. You just don't find them in there, kings that seek after the heart of God. And that's where Jonah is. He's a prophet to the kingdom of Israel. And in 2 Kings in chapter 14, you can read about him. He's a prophet serving under King Jeroboam. And so one of the positive things we see during that time is some reestablishment and some strengthening of their borders, some increasing of their territory. But of Jeroboam, it says he engaged in the evil of those who were before him. So this is the day and the time in which Jonah lived. Now, Jonah, as a prophet of God, was to hear the word of the Lord and to go and do whatever the word of the Lord commissioned him to do. So it's curious then that as we open this book up, what we read about this is that he does in fact hear the word of the Lord. Look at verse 1. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying." Now, this would have been clear. It would have been powerful. It would have been concise. We don't know exactly how this word came to him. If God hired some type of skywriter to go out and spell it in the sky, he impressed upon Jonah the word. But we know it would have been a clear message. It's not like he's driving down the bypass and all of a sudden, he's talking to God and he hits this kind of Bermuda Triangle of Hardin County and he gets no cell phone signal. And all of a sudden he comes to the other side and he's like, I don't have a clue what I'm supposed to do. I started to hear the word of the Lord. The next thing I know, I'm saying, wait, don't hang up. I don't know. You want pizza for dinner? Do you want a hamburger? I think bacon's probably off the menu, the whole kosher thing. But so he hears, there you go. He hears the word of the Lord. And it's a really clear, it's a really concise message. What does he say? He says, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it. So simply the commands are two, to arise and to call out. To arise and to call out. Now here's the why. He says, because their evil has come up before me. The text tells us essentially that their sin has become so pronounced that it has made its way. The aroma, the stench of their sin is rising even to highest heaven. And so God sends Jonah to go out, and what he's asking him to do, what he's commissioning him to do, is to go out and to call for their repentance, to call that they would change their behaviors, that they would change how they are, and they would move away from the pursuit of evil. So Jonah hears a really clear call. This is his job. This is what he was created for. This is what God has given him to do. So it's somewhat of a surprise that what we find Jonah doing is exactly the opposite. So God says, arise, go, call out against the city of Nineveh. And Jonah's like, okay, I got this. Early the next morning, he wakes up, he drinks his Folgers. Maybe he's got a little tiny cup, a little espresso. And then he hops and he runs completely the opposite direction. The text tells us quite plainly, it says, instead, or rather, Jonah rose and he fled to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Notice in verse 3 that phrase occurs twice. It begins and ends with this idea that he is moving from the presence of the Lord. So Jonah isn't just moving in disobedience to God. Jonah thinks that he can move geographically away from God. There's something happening in the heart and the life and the mind of Jonah that leads him to believe that obedience to God is optional. And that as a prophet of God, that he's able to kind of pick and choose his assignments. And he wants God to know so incredibly clearly that, so I'm sorry, like, I didn't see this in the syllabus. Like, this wasn't in the job description. When you said other duties as assigned, I was thinking like Disney World duties. I was thinking of other things that were, I don't know, not so terrible as going to Nineveh. And so he chooses not to go there. Now, the text doesn't tell us until we get into chapter 4 exactly what's going on in his heart. But there are some things historically we know about Nineveh. We know about the Assyrians. One of the leaders of the Assyrians, one of their kings, used to like to take people that he captured, and he would actually rip their lips off. Now, I had an uncle that used to say, "Oh, rip your lips off." And I was pretty terrified, but I don't think he meant it. This guy actually meant it. Like, he did this. This was his thing. I don't know how you develop that as a habit. I don't encourage you to pursue it. But he would rip people's lips off. He would tear their hands from their bodies. Another one of their rulers, not to be outdone, would take them and he would flay them alive. Peel their skin from their bodies while they were still living. He would take their skulls and mound them up in a pile. And so you can imagine being Jonah, you're laying there, you're thinking about how great the nation of Israel is, how really kind of terrible Jeroboam is, but he's the king you got, so he's the king you live with. You didn't vote for him, but that's okay. And so you're there, and God's like, I want you to go to, he's like, I can't hear you, God. I'm on the bypass. I can't hear you, God. He's like, I want you to, Jonah, I know you can hear me. Like, we're standing in the room together, brother. I know you can hear me. Don't you close your eyes. You can read my lips. I'm going to write it down for you. I'm going to press it on your heart. He says, I want you to go to Nineveh. And Jonah is like, he's thinking, this is not what I signed up for. This is not what I want to do. And so he directly disobeys God. He doesn't recognize that obedience to God and relationship with God are connected. So he tries to remove himself from the presence of God. He goes and he jumps on a boat. He hires this boat and he seeks to move away from the Lord. Well, verse 4 begins to show us God's response to the rebellion of Jonah. It's really interesting that as the writer of this text describes this, he says the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. This word hurled describes somebody throwing a javelin. So God pins Jonah in the midst of his rebellion to stop his abandon and moving away from the presence of the Lord. God catches Jonah in his desertion. And he does this by showing that he is sovereign, by showing that he is king over all the elements, showing that he is king over all of nature. And so he's out there, and listen to what the text goes on to say. It says, verse 5, the mariners were afraid, and they each cried out to his God, and they began to hurl the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. So Jonah is in this ship. He's down in the middle of it. The storm hits the waters, and all of these guys, these Phoenicians, these guys from up around the Mediterranean coast, that this is all they do. Like, all they do is transport cargo from point A to point B. And it's so violent that everybody begins to call out to their God. Who's your God? You call out to him. Who's your God? You call out to him. This pantheon of gods, everybody calling out to their own God, trying to figure out which God is so upset with which person so they can get out of this pickle and predicament. Now, they're doing this, and so there's just this kind of cacophony. There's this loud roar of all of these people crying out to all their various different gods, and nothing's getting any better. I mean, the waves are just getting worse. The conditions are getting worse. So they start looking around, and they take their livelihood. They're not paid to go out there and take people on a 3-hour tour. They're paid to transport cargo from point A to point B. And so they grab this cargo, they grab their livelihood, and they throw it over into the water because their lives are worth more than their cargo. So they're crying out to God, that's not helping. They're lightening the load on the ship, that's not helping. And where do we find Jonah in the middle of all of this chaos? Sleeping, that's right. I hadn't read that part, but that's super helpful, thank you. I was going to offer you a chance to come up here, but you do a good job, and my job would be in jeopardy. And so listen to what he says. It says, Jonah had gone down to sleep in the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. Doesn't that sound so peaceful? Do you remember that in the 80s they had water beds? And so there's a way to think of it. It's just kind of like a water bed, like it's got that gentle one or whatever. But no, like it says, they thought the boat was going to tear up. So Jonah's like, he's getting rolled this way. He's getting rolled that way. He's getting rolled this way, like water splashing on him. And down there from the depths of it, you hear. They're all crying out, and Jonah is sound asleep. He's just all tuckered out. And so the captain looks around, and everybody's crying out to their own gods, and he looks down in there and he sees Jonah, and so he yells down to him in the midst of all the chaos. He says, "What do you mean, you sleeper?" Now, I think that's probably a slur, but here it just says, "What do you mean, you sleeper?" And so he tells him, and he uses the same words of God. What was the command of God? He told Jonah, "Arise and call out." What does the captain say? He says, "Arise and call." You think that's lost on Jonah? This heathen, lost Gentile of a sea captain goes and he uses the same instruction and command to rouse Jonah from his sleep. Arise and call on your God. That's the last thing Jonah wanted to do. He was running from the presence of the Lord. And here this sea captain says, "Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." They're desperate and they want to do anything they can to be saved. And so they tell Jonah, "Join us in doing this thing." So Jonah comes up onto the deck of the ship, and what do we read in verse 7? It says, "So they said to one another, 'Come, let us cast lots that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us.'" Now, when they would cast lots, they'd have two stones, and each of the stones would have a light side and a dark side. And so they would take the stones and they would throw them down, and if they both came up on the light side, it would indicate a yes, and if they both would come up on the dark side, it would indicate a no, and if they'd come up mixed, they would just throw them again. And so from sailor to sailor to sailor, they're passing it, and they're like, "All right, so look, I know you. I saw you out drinking the other night, and so you cast these stones, and I know you got an issue, and you throw them, and they both come up on the black side. It's not an issue." And they're like, "All right, I don't want you," and you cast the stones. They both come up on the black side. They're like, "I really thought you were the evil one. I thought you were the one doing this." And so then they come over here to this side of the room, and they give them to Sawyer, and they're like, "Sawyer, cast these stones," and Sawyer casts them, and sure enough, they come up on the dark side again. They're like, "Man, I really thought I had it that time." And so they come back over here, and they hand them to Jonah, and they cast, and they come up yes. Now, the storms haven't stopped, but they have an answer for their problem. And having an answer for their problem, they're hoping that the answer to their problem can pursue a solution to what looks like death for them. So they say to Jonah in verse 8, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? Of what people are you?" They're just running through all the questions they can think of. They got to know his history in a short fashion. They're hoping he's not a long-winded storyteller. They need this thing fixed, and they need it fixed really fast. So Jonah says to them, "I am a Hebrew." Now that's how they would have known him. This is just his national heritage. But listen to what he says next. He says, "I fear the Lord." Now, do you believe that? Do you believe that Jonah fears the Lord? Maybe your translation says, "I worship the Lord." Fear of the Lord is tied to obedience. Worship of the Lord is tied to the posture of our hearts. What has the posture of Jonah's heart? What has the method of his life in this story revealed to us? He's living in disobedience. He is living in rebellion. But when push comes to shove, he knows the right thing to say to answer the question at the right time. He's still not serious. He says, "I fear the Lord," and then he begins to give him a name. He says, "He is the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land." Now, as these Phoenician sailors hear Jonah describe who this God is, and he says he is the God of heaven, they had an absolute category for that. They would have worshiped the god Baal Shammam, and he's the Lord of heaven. So they would have been totally fine with that. We understand that. Okay, we've got that. We're okay. We understand how that operates. But when Jonah appends to it, he is the Lord of all heaven who created the sea and the dry land. What he's communicating to them is my God didn't just create everything above. My God created everything. When he communicates that to them, they know that this situation is drastically different than they ever conceived it to be. And their response, it's really has this sense of kind of writing our hearts. Because their response is pure, and there is no posturing, there's no setup, there is no attempts at maintaining composure. What does it say? It's they heard this, and the men were exceedingly afraid. When he began to describe his God in terms of his supremacy over every God they'd ever conceived before, they knew that his God was in control of the sea that was spelling doom for their lives. They knew that this God held their lives in their hand, and they knew that somehow this guy was responsible for angering, frustrating, or moving in disobedience to this God. It made them terrified because they knew something of God that they'd never known before. They knew something of his power, his might, and his majesty. So the text tells us they were exceedingly afraid, and they began to ask him to call out. They began to say, "What is this you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing the presence of the Lord because he had told them so. One of the sad things about Jonah is that Jonah knew in some sense the truth that's articulated in Psalm 24, 1 and 2. The psalmist writes and says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers." You see, what Jonah knew wasn't making its way into his heart and into his life. Jonah knew that God created everything, he sees everything, and there's nowhere you can go to get away from him. But it brought him comfort to try. It brought him peace for a moment to attempt it. But here he was now explaining his vocation, explaining his life, explaining his God in a snapshot to men whose lives were put in jeopardy on the basis of his rebellion. So these guys turn to Jonah and they're like, okay, so here's what we're going to do. What do we need to do? Land dweller, what do we need to do that the sea would quiet down for us? And since what do we need to do that we don't die? Jonah gives it a think, and he responds plainly. He says, "Pick me up, hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you." Because he knew it's his fault that it was all happening. Pick me up, throw me in the water, everything's going to be fine. Now, can I just be real for a second? I'm trying to put myself in the place of being a lifetime mariner, and I get seasick. So this is really hard for me, but just go with me for a second. I feel like I'm going to die. It's the worst storm I've ever been in. This guy comes to me and he says he's the one to blame, and if I throw him into the water, that it's going to be okay. I think this is the moment that I really struggle with the text, because I'm rallying everybody to chuck him overboard. It was his idea. He volunteered himself. He says it's going to solve my problems. I'm not going to die. I'm selfish. I'm working through that. When they hear Jonah say this, completely opposite response. Something is occurring in them of the might and understanding of how powerful God is that they don't want to make him more angry. And so they row with everything they've got to try and get the ship to safety, to try and make it through the storm, to try and keep themselves from having to do something that in their minds at this moment is unconscionable. It's just unthinkable. They can't do it. But the harder they row, the harder they try, the worse it gets. So finally, they're left with no alternative. But before they do, before they give themselves to what Jonah has instructed to them, they call out to the Lord. Verse 14. It says, therefore they called out to the Lord. Lord, let us not perish for this man's life. They knew when they threw Jonah overboard, he was going to die. There's just really no question in their minds. He's going to die. Let us not perish for this man's life. Lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. One of the reasons that we can look at this and know that these sailors' lives are beginning to change in response to this God is that they use the name Yahweh in referring to him in this. He's not one God amidst a pantheon of gods. He is Yahweh God, the God of all heaven who created the sea and the dry land, the God who holds the universe in the power of his hand, and they seek his face for mercy before they act. So calling out to God, crying out before him, they go and they pick up Jonah, they hurl him into the sea, and the text tells us that everything stopped and it became perfectly calm. So what would you think is the response of the sailors? Like they've got what they wanted. They wanted the sea to be calm. They wanted everything to be easy. They wanted their lives to be saved. But in that moment, when they hurl him overboard and everything is tranquil and peaceful, the text tells us that their response is that the men feared the Lord exceedingly. You see, because an encounter of the power of God was transforming their lives. Paul writes about it in Romans 1. He talks about encountering the invisible attributes of God. That as we encounter him in nature, as we encounter him in life, that it leads us beyond the question that there is something more to this life. And so he says that they are without excuse. These men had gone through their life worshiping a pantheon of different gods, but now had come face to face with the one God who ruled everything. And when they saw his power and his might on display, it led them to worship. It said they feared exceedingly. They offered before him a sacrifice and they made vows to the Lord. It was nowhere in the heart of Jonah to impact the lives of the sailors. They were a means to an end for him. They presented a way of escape for him. I had a seminary professor named Roy Fish a number of years ago, and he described it this way. He said, God can hit straight licks with crooked sticks. You see, God didn't need a perfect missionary. God was able to do anything he wanted. And God presented himself in his mercy and his salvation to these sailors, even in the rebellion of Jonah. How many times when we see the rebellion of those around us, we see the rebellion, the waywardness of our kids, of our friends, of people we don't really know but we hear about, and we start to respond to their rebellion, but what it creates in us is an awareness of our own sin. Man, isn't that the graciousness of our God? He doesn't really just want us to look back and point and say, oh my goodness, look at the mess they're making. But in seeing the mess they're making, he illumines the mess in our own lives and shows his great love for us, that even in our moments of compartmentalized, safe, hidden rebellion, he is still pursuing us. God's delight is to take us from ignorance to make us worshipers. And over the course of our lives, he's doing this over and over and over again, calling us again and calling us back and calling us back. I want us to consider just 3 quick ways that we live in rebellion. Some of us today, we live in what I think is an easy way to consider this. Some of us are living in specific rebellion. Specific rebellion. Jonah was called vocationally to serve the Lord. Like this was his job. Some of you in here, you had a sense at some point in your life that God was calling you to vocational service and ministry. Like, I mean, it's just undeniable. Everybody you talked to said, yeah, I see this in you, except for your second grade teacher. She thought you were evil. But she's an outlier. Y'all forget her. And so everybody else, like they get, I see this in you. Like I see how God is moving in you and I see these things. But somehow in the busyness, the confusion, the difficulty, somehow just in life, you went a different direction. You know, it was super hard to avoid in the beginning. Do you remember that? It's like every day you woke up and you knew, God has a purpose for me. God has a plan for me. He's calling me into ministry. And you were excited about that. And like every week you want to talk about it. And then every month you want to talk about it. And then there was some time you didn't think about it. And then this other position came along. Other life happened. And the enemy, he's used a number of things in your life to keep you from submitting to that call. One of the things that he uses superbly in too many of our lives is success. I have a good friend whose brother had a definitive call to ministry. 100% knew he was called to ministry. But he was also in business, and so he's considering this, and he had a plan to pursue ministry and to go with this. And the longer he stayed in business, the more successful he got, and the more money he made, and the more influence he had, and the more power, and the more dependent he and his wife and his kids were on the vast wealth he'd accumulated. He never doubted his call, but the cost to follow it was greater and greater and greater. You have to let go of that success. For some of us, letting go of that success, changing that course in life, leads to a feeling of shame, a sense of embarrassment. The thought of severing our identity from what we've built it to be, of what it could give us, it's a cost we're not willing to relinquish. So some of us live in a really specific set of rebellion. There's something specific God has called you to, but you're not willing to let go. God has called you to go into work with Sunrise. God has called you to be a foster family. But you've already got 2 kids at home. You don't know how that would work. You've already got your vacations mapped out. You've got education savings accounts set up for your kids. Your kids are safe and healthy. That would be really hard on them. They'd have to sacrifice a lot. So you write a check to Sunrise. Some of you, God is calling you to go and work at Clarity, to volunteer your time there. But you already volunteer at your kid's school. You're in the PTA, you deal with parents in the pickup line. Y'all, that is a calling for sure, but maybe that's not your calling. Dr. Lafferty spoke last week, and it reminded you that God's called you to foreign missions. How would you even do that? You think about your success, you think about what life is like. And so you just forget the call that he has, and you go back down. Some of us, the rebellion in our life is so hidden and deep. But God's call to you, even now, no matter how many years later, listen to me, arise and go. He is calling people all over the world, and he wants to call them through you. It is the reason he created you. Arise, that he might call the nations to himself through you. Others of us, it's not this really specific sense of rebellion, and for that, we all let out a collective exhale. Whoa. Lord, raise up missionaries for the nation, just not me. And so our rebellion is really a partial rebellion, either through ignorance or indifference. There are things we choose not to know and not to be fazed by. And this really could run the gambit of so many things in our lives. But I want us as a body, just for a moment, y'all, can we consider just one thing? So y'all, the Bible's full of commands. I just want to use one, not as the example for everything, but just to illuminate maybe what it would look like if we were all to take seriously what it looks like to arise and to call out. Jesus, at the end of the Gospel of Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20, said some really simple words, but I want to make sure that I quote it accurately. So let me turn there. It's really kind of tricky in the very beginning. I feel like the first phrase is kind of hard. Nope, he just says go. No, in fairness, the Greek is as you're going, but he says, go therefore and make disciples of, everybody say, all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And then he says, listen, I'm with you. I'm not sending you alone. Behold, I am with you even to the end of the age. So some of us, this ability to engage in partial rebellion, to hear certain words of the Lord and to apply them in peaceful fashion for what is easy and what is comfortable. All the while we have emblazoned over our entrance to this church, this teaching that says that we are to make disciples, we are to love God, we are to love people. And this from the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 37, listen to what he says. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Essentially says, Jesus says, everything in here hinges on how we apply these things. It's so much easier to live in quiet rebellion. What would it look like for you to arise and call? What would it look like for you to be so captivated with your love of God that it permeated in everything and everywhere you go? Our marriages completely changed and transformed because we love God so radically that it makes us love our fellow image bearers completely. What would it be like if our love of God made it completely and utterly disdainful and disgusting for us to speak in a way that denigrates, that brings someone else down who's also a fellow image bearer made in the image and the likeness of God? See, you may not be called to vocational ministry, but y'all, we should see the people of Hardin County and beyond responding in faith because we should be calling them to faith. But it's so much easier, isn't it, to live in this partial rebellion because we're all in it together. And we've created a culture where it is okay to be a Christian and to be quiet about it. In fact, it's preferable. It's preferable. Some of us don't live in specific or partial rebellion. We live in complete and utter rebellion. For whatever reason, you were going through something in your life and you walked away from faith in Jesus Christ. You made a profession of faith as a kid, you're in high school, you're in college, you're early in your marriage. You stopped going to church, you stopped hanging out with a group of Christian friends, and it was difficult at first, and there were some pangs, but over the course of your life, it's gotten easier and easier. It's gotten easier not to let God be in your marriage, not to have God be in your family, not to have God, if we're going to be honest, not to have God be in your life. Can I tell you right now that if there's a sense in you that you have an awareness of that, that is the grace of God moving in your life and calling you back to himself. Hebrews 13 and verse 5 says it so plainly. God will never leave you nor forsake you. You can be just like Jonah and you can seek to run from the presence of the Lord, but he sees you. And maybe unlike your other relationships, he doesn't see you with a scowl on his face, but he sees you and his arms are open to you and he's calling you back to him. It is his love for you and his desire that you be saved and united with him, that his son went to the cross and from the cross to the grave, and from the grave he was resurrected, that you might be redeemed, not just from the sins of your past, but even from the sins that you exist in and enjoy right now. And can I just invite you back? Can I invite you out of rebellion to receive the embrace of God? Maybe you're here today. You've never rebelled against Christianity. You may even be a better Christian on the outside than anybody in here, anybody on staff, except for maybe Emery. I doubt you've got that. I'm pretty sure you don't have that. I was thinking about it. No, I don't think you've got that. You're not a Christian. You come to church and you're not even sure why all the time. There's some people you enjoy the morality, you just need friends. I don't know what it is. But the way the Bible paints it, outside of Jesus, you're living in rebellion. Your morality, your goodness, your likability, and those things are beautiful in you. And that is a picture of the grace of God in you. But what you need is salvation from God, and that through Jesus Christ. And so today, the invitation to you is to recognize that you are living in rebellion to God. And it's got nothing to do with how you act. It has everything to do with your relationship with Jesus. And so the offer for you today is to come to know and be known by Jesus. And so what we're doing in communicating this to you is fulfilling our obligation to be those who have risen and are now calling you to faith and trust in Jesus. Will you be obedient to arise and to call him Father and to call out to him for salvation?